Dr. Alison Knight, and I'm a lecturer here at Royal Holloway in Interdisciplinary Early Modern Studies, which I do half of my teaching in the history department here and the other half in English. The King's Great Matter is a term that we use to describe, Henry VIII's attempt to escape his marriage to Katherine of Aragon, his first wife. That question of what do we mean by great matter is a good one, because there's been a lot of argument about terminology, and great matter is kind of often used as a way to escape having to make a choice between referring to it as the divorce or the annulment. Traditionally, it was referred to as the divorce. But then we get, historians saying, well, actually, Henry VIII was seeking an annulment. He was looking for an official pronouncement that his marriage had never legally taken place, that he had never been legally married to Katherine of Aragon. So this is what has driven many people to refer to it as the annulment. But to that, I would again say, well, actually, historians, we love to say that, well, actually, yes, this is what Henry wanted, absolutely, but we don't necessarily have to let Henry, have the last word. Catherine's supporters, on the other hand, were always very adamantly resisting this terminology of annulment. Terms matter, and they were very consciously using this term of divorce, because what it came down to was, did this marriage ever actually exist? And using that term divorce for them was very much a way of saying, you can't just change history. You can't erase. At this point, they've been married for about 2 decades. He starts pursuing this when they've almost been married for 2 decades. It doesn't happen until they've been married for longer than that. They're saying that you can't just sweep this under the rug or pretend it didn't happen. It happened. By all means, seek a divorce. I mean, they weren't saying that either, but you have to call a spade a spade. And so it might seem like a minor matter, terminology, historians quibbling over what do we call this, but it's kind of fundamental to how this was imagined at the time. And so which one do you choose? Do you go with divorce? Do you go with the annulment? I mean, we see a big divide amongst historians today. Personally, I feel like we have to go with what Martin Luther says about, when he's asked to choose between which side is he on, Catherine or Henry's, and he says really it's a kind of a he said, she said sort of thing, and it comes down to who do you trust more, Catherine or Henry? And I choose Catherine, is what Martin Luther says, and I kind of have to agree. I don't think that, I think, 2 decades in, they were married, it's a divorce. That's just my opinion on it. Another major question that really drives historians approaching the divorce is, what was motivating Henry? Was he just seeking an heir? Was that what was the kind of the linchpin of the whole thing, was his desire for a male heir? And at this point, 2 decades in the first decade of their marriage, Catherine had had numerous miscarriages and stillborn children, and they'd also had a son, Henry, who died at about 7 weeks. So at this point, there's only Princess Mary as their only living child. So, Catherine's last pregnancy was in 1518. At this point, we're talking about in the late 1520s. By this point, it's quite clear that she's not going to be producing any male heirs for Henry. And so, is this all that's really driving him when it comes down to it? Or is his infatuation with Anne Boleyn, which, he starts to be infatuated with her in the late 1520s, is this what's driving him? Or again, is it that he was always seeking control of the Church of England? And really, it's all three. These are overlapping concerns that feed one another and that mesh well. So all pointing him kind of in this direction. But really, even though one of the things that has really driven historians is trying to understand what Henry was after, I'm often more interested not in what was driving Henry, but what changes, what contemporary developments did the great matter itself drive, or at least contribute to. And one of those major issues is scriptural interpretation. Because throughout, regardless of what was actually motivating him, Henry always framed what he was trying to do in scriptural terms. Because we have in Scripture a very clear pronouncement in Leviticus 18:16, which basically prohibits someone from marrying their brother's widow. And Catherine was indeed Henry's brother's widow. So before Henry's marriage to Catherine, she had in fact been married to his elder brother Arthur for about 4.5 months until Arthur's death in 1502. And Henry VII had obtained a dispensation from the Pope to allow his younger son Henry to marry Katherine of Aragon. And this kind of dispensation was pretty common at the time. But with the difficulties of having children in particular, Henry finds confirmation in this verse of Leviticus, which also says that these kinds of marriages will not produce children, as confirmation for actually, the Pope had no power to dispense with this law. This is a law, a scriptural law, God's law, which transcends the Church's laws. So the Pope has no power to dispense with this. So from his perspective, from his supporters' perspectives, this is a clear-cut case. The Bible clearly says you can't marry your brother's widow. So there you have it, done and dusted. But for Catherine supporters, the case was not so clear. Because we have another verse, Deuteronomy 25:5, which rather than prohibiting marriage to a brother's widow, it positively commands it if he dies without leaving children behind, which was the case with Arthur. So seemingly now you have two very clear pronouncements from Scripture that say opposite things. One says marry your brother's widow, one says you can't. So how do we reconcile these two apparently contradictory verses of Scripture, especially when contemporaries, people at this time, and certainly everyone involved in the divorce, shared the belief that the Bible could not contradict itself, that it gave a singular, unified truth, God's truth. So how could it possibly be contradictory? So we see enormous developments happening around the time of the divorce in terms of how we interpret Scripture. In particular, we see the great matter driving forward Hebrew scholarship at the time, as people on the king's side in particular, but actually both sides are trying to turn to the original text of the Hebrew Bible to find new ways of understanding each meaning, to find ways to kind of fit these two verses together, turning to rabbinical texts to help understand how what practices these verses are describing. Kind of reevaluating how you fit together scriptural interpretation with church law, with the interpretation of text that's happening with humanism at this time. So it's, yes, absolutely, it's very interesting to think about what's driving Henry, but it's also really interesting to think about what other changes does the great matter drive forward.